special edition of ET Now. As 2022 draws to an end and we get ready to welcome the new year, we at ET Now are particularly delighted to have a very special guest with us. We have with us Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and presently Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Raghu, of course, is no stranger to our viewers. We often get him to give his expert opinion on a whole host of macro issues. But this annual year-end interview has now become a regular feature of ET Now, and our viewers really look forward to this. It's a much look forward to event at ET Now. So this is the third year in a row that Raghu has taken time out to share his views with our viewers, and given that his knowledge and his experience spans a broad canvas of both macro as well as fiscal issues, we're particularly privileged to have with us Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Welcome to the show, Raghu. It's a treat to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a delight, as I said. But it's been almost a year, Raghu, since we spoke last. And the global economy, unfortunately, hasn't recovered the way we hoped it would. Of course, there is a possibility of COVID showing its face again, but that's relatively minor as of now. The bigger worry really is about Ukraine. It has muddied the waters. But could that be the only reason why growth has not recovered the way it should? The IMF has already said that about a third of the global economy will face some kind of a recession. Do you agree with that very gloomy outlook? And what is the reason for it, Raghu?
Well, I think the war in Ukraine certainly made the inflation problem much worse than it was anticipated to be, with the rise in price of commodities, the disruption in supply chains and so on, adding to what was already there. So it was not irrelevant. But I think what central banks are finding out also is that they were perhaps a little too complacent at the beginning of 2022, something we talked about in our last discussion. And I think that now they're catching up. They've certainly raised rates fast. And it is this, the rise in interest rates, the rise in mortgage rates, the decline in housing, all of which is causing the possibility of a recession next year. Now, I think the jury is still out on whether we will have a full-fledged recession. What will drive, a really bad recession are collateral factors, like, for example, a financial sector meltdown, factors like that. I think as of now, the most prominent scenario is perhaps a slowdown, which may technically become a recession, but will not necessarily lead to deep job cuts. That at least is the hope of the Fed and other central banks.
Well, I hope you're right on that. But coming specifically to the US economy, we've seen inflation, over there. The numbers are way over the Fed's target of 2%. And the Fed seems determined to get it back to that 2%. What will the price of this be, this determination to get inflation back to 2%? How will this impact the US economy, the global economy, and emerging markets, especially markets like India?
Well, that is precisely the point, right? That the Fed is behind the curve. However, the actions it has taken thus far are starting to show up in lower inflation. Inflation has been coming down from about the 9% level down to 7% in the November reading. And incremental inflation has also come down significantly. Goods price inflation is falling a lot, partly compensating for the earlier rise. What is left is services inflation, which is still strong. Now, this is where the labor market matters, because the labor market is very tight still. We're still seeing job growth. And so the Fed basically wants to see some slack in the labor market build up so that it can then be assured that you won't have a wage price spiral emerging, that as inflation stays high, wages don't pick up to meet inflation, causing yet more inflation. So that is why Chairman Powell has been insistent that he wants to see labor slack. Of course, the Fed has already raised interest rates quite a bit, probably will do another 25 basis points for the next two rounds. And then somewhere around five and some change, it will pause to see what happens. Now, the market is betting that this will be enough, that the economy will slow a lot, and as a result, the Fed will start cutting soon. Now, this is where the Fed is a little bit a prisoner of expectations. It's been pounding on the table saying, we're not going to cut. We're going to stay the course, wait till enough slack builds up, till we are sure that we will go back to our target range. Now, I think disinflation is already on the way. Unless we have another oil price shock or something like that, we will see significant disinflation over the next year. The key for the Fed is, will it bring inflation back to its target range of around 2.5 on the CPI? And that is the real question, because bringing it down to 3.5, 4 is going to be relatively sort of on the cards. It is the next step, bringing it down within its target range, which will be most difficult. And this is where opinions differ tremendously. Bottom line, I don't think anybody really knows, A, what growth will really be next year, B, how long the Fed will have to stay with high rates. I think the Fed is guessing much as everybody else is guessing. There are a variety of scenarios possible. Anybody pounding on the table today and saying, I know, is really being excessively optimistic about their capabilities.
Which just shows how economics is anything but like a physical science. All the rocket scientists who have entered economics, really, it's very much more a political economy. Would you agree, Raghu?
Well, I mean, partly it is political in the sense that, one of the impediments to inflation fighting today is the willingness of governments to spend yet more. I think in Europe, for example, the untargeted spending on energy support, it's not just the poor households which do need support, but giving it to big firms also, which is creating more of an inflationary problem. So yes, there is a political element to it. Of course, central banking is always, to some extent, political, and so I think the inflation fight is being subject to it also. But I think at this point, it is also a technical issue. How much do central banks need to keep the rate high in order to bring economic activity down to a level that they feel comfortable with? More of a problem in Europe, where the shocks are more on the supply side rather than demand. In the US, it's clearer that it's a demand shock, and the Fed needs to keep going until demand slows down.
Yes, that's something straight from the horse's mouth. As somebody who's been at the head of the Reserve Bank of India, yes, inflation is partly a political problem also. But now let me turn to the other gorilla in the room, Raghu, which is China. And frankly, one knows so little really about what's happening in the economy. We in India are very hopeful about the China +1 working out, the +1, of course, being India. But do you think India will really be able to benefit substantially from what the kind of turmoil that we're seeing in China, the fact that many MNCs are moving away from China? How does what is happening in China impact us? Do you see the Chinese economy recovering next year?
Well, the Chinese economy will probably recover towards the second half of next year, simply because the shocks it has been subject to have been pretty significant this year. Certainly, some of the policy shocks, such as the action against the private sector that China took up, aided and augmented by Chinese officials, has been problematic. The fight with the rest of the world, primarily with the United States, on tariffs has been problematic. The concern now that China at some point may, take action against Taiwan is something that certainly worries a lot of businesses. And of course, the zero COVID policy, which was maintained for far longer than its sell-by date, and now has sort of reverted to a sort of free-for-all, which is causing enormous sort of havoc in China in terms of COVID, the spread of COVID, as well as deaths, which, like many countries, China is suppressing the true numbers. on it. So all this makes business much more wary. And I think one of the biggest things that businesses look for is policy certainty. With the centralization of policy in China, they worry about actions that are based on the whim of the moment by a leader who may be poorly informed about the consequences of those actions. We are seeing the fallout from the actions on real estate that China took, a couple of years ago. We're seeing the fallout of zero COVID policy. So that kind of policy volatility and uncertainty makes companies want alternatives. Now, India is one of a number of countries companies are looking at. I would say India is not necessarily even number one on that list, though the Indian market, large as it is an attractive option. Countries are also looking at Vietnam, where the policies are a little more certain, a little less volatile, and they have many of the characteristics of China. So Vietnam often is the China plus one. But Mexico for US firms is another China plus one because it has the benefit of being much closer and, of course, being within NAFTA. I think for India to be well and truly the China plus one, it has to make changes on the policies that it has, including to stop raising tariffs. Tariffs are a deterrent to firms locating in India. It has to make policies much more certain and less sort of against foreign direct investment, some of which we've seen, for example, against companies like Amazon and Walmart to favor domestic participants. So India has some way to go. It is definitely in the consideration set of many companies, and where India has strengths, for example, scientific personnel, R&D, people are coming to India, but it can do far more to benefit from this moment, and that requires good, sound policy.
Oh, well, absolutely. One of the problems is that we never really performed up to our full potential. We're getting there, but we're always just getting there, never there. But now let me turn to India. And you spoke about raising tariffs. But the fact is that unfortunately, the latest numbers that we've got on the current account deficit are truly alarming. For the September quarter, it's 4.4%, well over the danger mark of about 2 to 2.5. Is there a sense of deja vu? Because we are again seeing, are we again seeing the emergence of twin deficits? Because the fiscal deficit is already high, though the government has done a fairly commendable job of keeping it within range, roughly, given the circumstances. But now we're seeing current account deficit also very high. Exports are not likely to do very well this year, given the fact that the global economy is going to slow down. And imports, meanwhile, will rise, especially if we're hopeful of a recovery. So where does all this leave us? We've already seen the rupee weaken by 11%. And that means further adding to inflationary pressures. So how do we tackle the current account deficit, especially if we're not going to raise tariffs also?
Start first with the causes. I think you've pointed out very clearly. One of the phenomena during the pandemic was private savings went up because there's nowhere for them to go in spending. Private savings went up. And as a result, even though the government deficit ballooned out, it was compensated in part by private savings. As a result, our dependence on external savings, that is the current account deficit, was relatively small. Now, as economic activity has picked up, private spending has increased, and as a result, the current account deficit has ballooned, especially because the government hasn't cut back on its spending. Now, some of it is very necessary, including the spending on, for example, food security for poorer people. But, put that aside, there's another problem which is emerging, which is partly contributing to the current account deficit, which is the distributional consequences over the last few years. The lower middle class has been hurt much more by the effects of the pandemic, by the effects of demonetization, the trend towards formality caused by the GST. And what this then means is that their savings, their spending have been much more limited. You can see it, for example, in the complete collapse of the two-wheeler market relative to, say, the passenger car market. On the other hand, the rich have more money at this point in India. Their jobs are still secure. They're earning much more. And their spending tends to fall much more on foreign goods. Take, for example, Mercedes cars, which the ultra-rich spend on. There, what you're seeing is a substantial growth in sales this year, coming back to 2018-19 levels when it had record sales. So we're seeing a distributional change in spending in India also, partly because the lower middle class has been significantly hurt, both in terms of jobs, employment, as well as in spending power. And so the natural consequence of all this is the current account deficit is blowing out. 4.4% is not a number we should feel comfortable with. We have to act on it. But the answer is not really to, erect tariffs and to try and do import substitution. We've been down that path before. And if anything, as we talked about earlier, it will deter foreign investment. It will deter fund flows into India, which are more stable, and make it much harder for us to reach a proper balance. I would instead advocate significant reforms going forward in order to elevate growth.
Well, yes, significant reforms is always what we're hoping for, but in a democracy, it does become that much more difficult. But turning now to the Reserve Bank of India, last time when we spoke, the RBI was still on an easing cycle. And like the Fed and many other central banks, it was clearly behind the curve. Since then, it has tried to catch up. It has raised rates by about 225 basis points. The question now is, will further tightening hurt growth? How much more tightening do we require? The talk often is that our inflation is not that high, not that much above the upper end of the target, 6%, unlike the Fed. But the fact is that we've had inflation for much, much longer also, unlike the Western countries. So how much further tightening can we have? How much will it hurt growth? What is the inflation growth trade-off? Is there a trade-off at all?
Well, let me first not comment directly on RBI policy, which I've avoided since I left office. And primarily it's because people think I know more than I do about their policies, and I don't. But what I will say is this, that, recent inflation numbers have come down. CPI because of vegetable prices, for example. That's a good thing, but it's not something that one can rely on. What one should be looking at is core inflation as a indicator of CPI inflation going forward. And I think those numbers are much less comfortable. Second, being within the band, which we just achieved with the CPI number last month, is not the ultimate goal of monetary policy. It is to keep it at a reasonable level, which typically I would take to mean somewhere around the center of the range, that is around 4%, rather than just at the outer limit of 6%. So there is some way to go to bring inflation down to a level that is comfortable. That said, I would not ignore the benefits of having kept inflation relatively under control this time around. The rupee has depreciated, but if you look at in relative terms compared to some of the other currencies, you would say that thus far at least, it's done reasonably relative to some of the other currencies. The real issue has been dollar strength, rather than the weakness of other currencies. But that said, I think we cannot afford to lose the fight against inflation. Inflation is already very high for the ordinary person, and we need to do more to keep inflation under control. Now, in an environment where you have a large current account deficit, where you have global growth slowing, where you have domestic growth still reliant on just upper middle class spending rather than lower middle class spending, I think navigation is much more difficult. The Reserve Bank of India does not have an easy job ahead of it.
Of course, no central bank has an easy job, and I won't try and pin you down on specific numbers as far as the RBI is concerned. But let me ask you a more generic question, Raghu, on interest rates and liquidity. The question is that in the past, what we've seen is that the MPC rather has been, hiking rates, but liquidity very often has been kept accommodative, or even now, it just has focused on withdrawal of liquidity, as a result of which we've seen disagreement even within the MPC. So we've seen the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, the much respected Dr. C. Rangarajan say in his recent book that interest rates and liquidity must move in the same direction. We haven't seen that in the past. Now, how important is it for these two to move in sync?
It depends on how liquidity flows into tightening financial conditions, right? I mean, ultimately, what the central bank is trying to do by raising policy rates is to tighten financial conditions, reduce activity, and therefore make it more commensurate with the supply capacity of the economy and thus bring inflation down. Now, I think that what Dr. Rangarajan must be referring to is the way liquidity can sometimes sort of support activity, even while you're raising interest rates to shrink activity, and then you have the central bank's liquidity function acting as at cross purposes to its monetary function. Now, part of the problem, and this is not just for the RBI, this is a problem we have highlighted for the Fed, is that in the last few years, central banks have flooded the markets with liquidity. And as a result, what they find is that much of that liquidity has in effect been absorbed by the markets, and the markets are constantly clamoring for more. And that means that when the central bank is tightening conditions and it starts withdrawing liquidity, very quickly you see strains showing up in the financial markets. This does suggest that a policy of abundant liquidity is a little bit like Chakravyuh. It's really hard to get out of it once you get into it, and this is something that central banks have to reflect on, as they do a postmortem of the experience post-financial crisis. I think Dr. Rangarajan is right that in order to tighten monetary conditions, you have to tighten liquidity, but central banks have to tread on that path very, very carefully, because too tight liquidity can create financial complications, including potential failures of some financial institutions. So they have to be careful about it and examine how they do it. But certainly it will be a help in the fight against inflation.
Well, it certainly is a tightrope walk, but is there a case to relook at the inflation targeting experience in the Indian context, particularly the mandate? Because what we've seen is that the MPC takes one decision, but liquidity management is not in their purview, as a result of which we often find contradictions. So should the MPC also be given oversight of liquidity apart from just the repo rate? Is there a case to rework that mandate?
Look, I don't want to enter a debate which probably is already fraught. Let me just step back from India and say more generally, the of monetary policy is to tighten financial conditions. And given that central banks have been acting on using a variety of tools, including not just the policy rate, but also various liquidity management tools. I mean, think about central bank balance sheet expansion or quantitative easing, which India has also engaged in. That has been an attempt to affect the long rate and to control that particular part of the spectrum. And of course, Japan has intervened directly in yield curve control in trying to control the long rate. So all the tools that are necessary to determine financial conditions, if they are under the central bank, should be under the purview of the Monetary Policy Committee as a general principle. Where the details, of course, may differ from country to country. But as a general principle, they should be within the purview of the Monetary Policy Committee.
Okay, Bhargav, one last question on inflation targeting before I move away. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is because it really began during your tenure. So one last question on inflation targeting is that the RBI recently had to write a letter to the government as required under the inflation targeting, the amendment to the RBI Act. But that letter has not been made public. Now, given the fact that the whole idea of moving to inflation targeting was to bring about greater transparency, is there a case for making these letters public? It is made public in many other countries. So this is purely a very academic kind of question, not in the Indian context necessarily, but broadly that should these letters be made public so that we understand, the public understands, and there's greater transparency?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that these should be made public. Part of what the central bank is trying to do is affect the public's expectations. That's a big channel through which it works. So it is very important the public understand why the central bank has failed in its primary task and how it intends to bring matters back under control. The letter is a way for the central bank to communicate, not just to the government. I mean, who cares what a few bureaucrats in government think, but about what the general public sort of thinks about the central bank's task. And this is why across the world, these kinds of letters are made public, and it is important to understand what special reasons the RBI and the government have for not following that path.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I now want to move on, Raghu, to cryptocurrencies. The RBI is clearly concerned, as are most central banks, about the rise of cryptocurrencies. In fact, the governor has gone so far as to say he sees the next financial crisis coming out of cryptocurrencies. How do you view these? Are these a serious danger to macroeconomic stability? And how should central banks respond?
I think that cryptocurrencies were largely touted as a vehicle for payments. And I think that promise has fallen far short. Very few payments are done using cryptos other than in sort of a circle that uses cryptos to buy cryptos and so on. I think, therefore, it's less of a central bank concern and more of a concern for the securities regulator that these are securities that are being used for speculation. And therefore, there is a reason for looking at whether, in fact, there is appropriate due diligence, whether the proceeds of some of these crypto sales, token sales are used appropriately as advertised, and so on. I mean, there is a group which says, look, who cares? These are people who are speculating and they lose money in speculation, so we shouldn't worry. But I think there's a reason why we regulate securities to make sure that the public doesn't get disillusioned. There's a reason we regulate chit funds. So I think that the reason to regulate cryptos is similar. You want to make sure that at least appropriate due diligence has been followed. Now, the worry that regulators have is that if they do pronounce on cryptos and say, at least they're not running away with the money, then immediately people will think of it as a license to invest in cryptos. And certainly many people, including me, feel that at present cryptos have little value other than as a speculative device that is, it is based on somebody else being willing to buy from you, even though something has no intrinsic value, what is otherwise known as a pure bubble. So given that, I think regulators have tried to stay away. But certainly in the US, where the cryptos amount to $3 trillion, there was a certain sense in which you were subjecting ordinary citizens to something they didn't understand. Some of them invested a lot of money in it and have suffered significant losses. And that could cause a general disillusionment with investing. And that is why at least some minimum due diligence and many caveats in public saying that these are untested, uncertain securities, a public campaign of that sort accompanied with minimum regulation would be, in my view, the appropriate approach. I don't think you want to regulate these out of existence because there may be technologies here that are useful in the future, but at present, they should be treated as highly speculative, risky securities.
Yes, I think central bank's task has been made a little easier by the collapse of FTX. But are CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, really an answer? Because in RBI in India, we've started a pilot project. But given the pace at which digitization, in fact, it's kudos to the RBI and the government here, given the fact that digitization has proceeded so rapidly in the country and has really permeated almost the entire economy. So in such a scenario, is the benefit of a CBDC a little overrated, particularly if you talk about, cross-currency dealings? It's only if other central banks also move towards CBDC, about which they're being much more cautious. Are CBDCs really the answer? Should we proceed a little bit more slowly, particularly given that we have achieved most of the benefits through digitization?
I think you're absolutely right that, as far as retail payments go, UPI basically has taken us a long way. We started it in 2016. It's gone through leaps and bounds. And for any retail payment, there's no reason why you need anything more than UPI right now. Now, as far as wholesale payments go, large payments, we already have the central bank involved in those large payments. And again, the need for a central bank digital currency does not seem that great. I think we certainly need to understand the technology. We need to proceed cautiously on building out a rupee CBDC. But I think urgency to do it, because there is a consumer demand, at this point is simply not there. There is a need to learn more, to understand, because in the global arena, the rules for CBDCs are now being, mapped out. And we need to be participants in that rulemaking so that we don't find ourselves at a disadvantage at some future point. That said, there are a number of concerns with a central bank digital currency. One, to what extent will you displace bank deposits, and how, if you do displace bank deposits, will you sort of get the money back into the private sector to lend, or even the public sector banks to lend? That's one concern. The second is the potential for volatility. If it becomes easy to convert your money into central bank digital currency, then you could have runs on shaky banks, which are much faster than the runs currently, because right now you still may have to go physically to the bank to extract your money. With digital currencies, it becomes very easy to do that transformation. So there's a lot of thinking. Perhaps the most important sort of thing to think through is how will you keep up with technological change? For example, hacking technology is increasing by leaps and bounds. How do you make the central bank digital currency impervious to latest developments in hacking? That means you have to have a flexibility in the central bank digital currency technology also, which keeps pace with developments outside. And that's something the RBI, as other central banks, have to be thinking carefully about. Bottom line, I would say it's certainly worth experimenting, but I think until we are a lot more certain about the benefits of central bank digital currencies, I would hold off on large-scale rollout.
Okay. Let me now turn to banking, Raghu. You began the cleanup of bank balance sheets. And yes, bank balance sheets are much cleaner today than they were during your time. But the fact is that we really haven't had much success as far as NPA management is concerned. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code really hasn't delivered. Now we've tried almost everything. Barring the kitchen sink, we've thrown everything at it. What really is the answer for NPAs? Is the root cause really judicial delays and not being able to really adopt the market economy, the 3 C's as we've spoken about? What really is the answer to NPAs, which are inevitable in the banking system?
Well, I think it has to be two-pronged, right? One, we have to improve the quality of lending decisions. I'm still sort of perturbed that we don't we don't allocate responsibility for large loans within many of the public sector banks, and track who makes these loans. Now, making one bad loan is not an issue. If you're a reasonable banker taking some risks, that's going to happen. But if 90% of the loans you've made are bad, that does signify either incompetence or corruption. And we simply don't allocate responsibility or track. We need to make better loans. And I think that's, at the outset. But also, in terms of recovery, I think we have had one scheme after another, each one trying to do a little more. And these tend to be more draconian for the really small entities because they have very little power. They can't hire good lawyers and so on. But the large entities, after an initial period when these schemes are effective, think of the debt recovery tribunals, think of SARFAESI, and now think of the the bankruptcy code, they are successful for a little while. Then the large players understand the system and manage then to get around it. And I think the judiciary has some burden to bear here because they have intervened far too much and slow down the process tremendously. Slowing down the process of resolution is the death knell because then immediately banks become much more reluctant to invoke it because they know that it means that the assets are tied up for much longer, and they tend to then accept unfavorable compromises with borrowers, and that slows down, of course, the whole process of lending. So, bottom line, I don't think we need yet another code. I think we need a serious re-examination of what is going wrong with the bankruptcy code, and we need, convene the judiciary also in this process and get them to promise to lay off in a significant way. Not everything has to go, first through the appellate bodies in the bankruptcy court, and then further into the High Court and the Supreme Court. That just kills any kind of resolution. And they have to understand this is for the good of business, because without easy resolution, credit is going to be really hard. And ultimately, since our public sector system is such a big part of the losses, it rebounds to the taxpayer, and they should be aware of it. So I think what we need is not yet another code, but re-examination of what is going wrong, and the judiciary participating and effectively putting rules on itself on how much intervention it will undertake.
Absolutely. And better supervision also from the supervisor and regulator of banks. But Raghu, budget 23-24 is just round the corner. And I know you would not like to comment specifically on this government's budget, but broadly in our kind of circumstances, given that the fiscal deficit is already very high, inflation is very high, what should the broad approach be to maintain that fiscal prudence and redirect your expenditure, or let the fiscal deficit, remain as it were for the moment, given that we're still not out of the woods? What would your suggestion be? Purely academic, as I said, not specifically advice to the present finance minister.
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the strains are building. As you said, the current account deficit is a strong indicator. Inflation is another indicator that there are strains in the system. And so we have to be much more cautious on what we spend on. We do need targeted spending at the very poor, but we also need to understand even the layer above that, the lower middle class is suffering because of the lack of jobs, and therefore the reality is the answer to many of this is to find new ways of growth. I know we are going into an election year, not this year, but the next one. So this budget is a preparation for an election year. But I think the best thing the government could do is focus on how it re-energizes growth. And that is something that has, even before the pandemic, growth was slowing. The numbers in the pandemic are very hard to make out because you have quarters of abysmal growth followed by quarters of spectacular growth. But look at current growth relative to 2019. Over the last 3 years, if you look at last quarter's growth relative to the similar quarter in 2019, we've grown at 2.5% a year. That is just unsustainable. We cannot create the jobs we need if we grow at that miserable pace. And the government has to understand that more than infrastructure, on which it's doing a good job, more than infrastructure, it has to create the environment for growth. All these industrialists who are clapping and saying the government is doing a great job, why are they not investing if they think that's a great job? Why don't they put their money where their mouth is? And the answer is they are very, very, at this point, they're not very optimistic about the growth scenario. And that is why they're not investing as much as they should to elevate the growth pace of the economy. So I would say the government has to reassure them in many ways, including on tariffs, on taxes, but also on the reform agenda. If it can come out with a vision for reforms, which is sensible, sustainable, and energize them in the growth process, that I think would be the greatest contribution from this budget. I'm afraid, however, that it will be more limited. And what I really dread is yet another round of tariff increases, which will make us even more high cost and make it harder for us to become that China plus one.
You know, Raghu, you spoke just now again about raising tariffs, and you also spoke about creating jobs. And this is where the government has done what it can do, perhaps, but through the PLI scheme, where it's raised tariffs on a number of items which is included under the PLI scheme. And one of the successes of the PLI scheme really has, there were a lot of skeptics, let me tell you, to start with, and I'm sure all of us were also skeptics. But as far as mobile phones was concerned, PLI has delivered enormously. So does that mean we need to do more such PLI raises, get more items under the PLI, raise tariffs, if it's going to create jobs?
You want to examine that last fact a little more carefully. Mobile phones, certainly we're producing many more of them. But look at the import of mobile phone components into the country. Are we producing all those components or are we importing more? When I took a look at that particular sector, what I found was certainly we are producing more in the country, but our imports have also increased considerably in that area. Now, why is that? It's because PLI rewards production, but doesn't necessarily, for mobile phones especially, doesn't have a value-added requirement. You're not necessarily required to produce more value-added in the country. If you assemble and put it out, you get the benefits of PLI. So if I'm Samsung, I just move my assembly into this country and produce more. Of course, over time, the hope is that they will produce more components in this country and so on, and that may be happening. But I would not simply look at the production in this country or the exports of cell phones. There's a tremendous incentive given under PLI, 4,000 to 5,000 rupees per phone for doing that. And no wonder they do it. What I'm worried about PLI is twofold. One, after these incentives cease, will we really still have an industry, or are people taking advantage of these incentives to temporarily produce in the country? And that requires for them to site much more in India than they're doing now. That may happen, but it is something to keep in mind. Second, are we providing subsidies in an area where there's no need to subsidize? I mean, if Tata's wants to build solar cells, or if Adani wants to do it, why are we subsidizing them? Who determines which sectors are subsidized? And has anybody done a cost-benefit analysis on how many jobs are being created for the subsidy? I'm particularly perturbed about this claim that we're going to build chips in this country with enormous subsidies. How many jobs are going to be created by that? And do we really think that when we put all this in place, we are going to be state of the art in chips? I mean, certainly when you look at the investments that the US is doing, that Taiwan is doing, they're far beyond what we are contemplating. We're trying to do it on the cheap. Maybe we can. But I don't think the players that are currently being touted, Vedanta, has any competence in making chips. I simply don't understand how these players are being picked, who's picking them, who's picking the sectors. There's a whole lot of subsidy going on without any kind of
a lot of questions to be asked. True. True. You know, Raghu, I told you at the beginning, I said we'd confine our, discussion to economics. But I know there's one question that our viewers will not, forgive us if I let you go without asking you. So this is my very last question to you. Was your joining of the Bharat Jodo March, was that an indication that you might be contemplating entering politics someday?
No, that reflects my concern as a citizen, that I believe our greatest strength is our democracy. I believe our greatest strength is communal harmony. I believe our greatest strength is debate. And I think all these are, under threat. And I really, as a citizen, want to add my voice to those who are saying, let us strengthen these. Let us strengthen our institutions, because that is how India will prosper, but also live amicably among nations. So this was a small walk as a citizen. It didn't reflect political ambition. It didn't reflect anything except that I am a citizen of India and I believe in these things.
Okay, so as of now, we'll have to wait for you to take that plunge, and maybe someday you will. But I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. And as with all good things, I'm afraid this interview and this discussion must also end. Thank you so much, Raghu, for taking time out and sharing your views with our viewers. Really wonderful talking to you. As I said, it's become a year-end feature. So thank you very much. And here's wishing you all the very best in 2023 from all of us at ET Now. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of our viewers as well. Thank you very much, Raghu. Have a great year.
Same to you and your viewers.